At 0710 hours on June 1st, 1942, 25-year-old Ensign Albert Ernest strapped himself into the cramped cockpit of a brand-new Grumman TBF Avenger on Eastern Island, Midway Atoll, preparing for a torpedo run he knew might be suicide. He had flown only 6 combat missions, none with a torpedo that had ever worked. Behind him, 17-year-old radioman 3rd Class Harry Fryer checked his .50 caliber trick gun, while 19-year-old Seaman 1st Class J. Manning settled into the belly gun position. The 3 men had flown together for only 3 days, long enough to understand that the weapon they carried into combat had a failure rate so high it bordered on criminal negligence. Ahead of them, 180 miles northwest, the Japanese fleet was steaming toward Midway for carriers, battleships, cruisers. The most powerful naval strike force on Earth, Ernest and the other 5 Avengers in his detachment would fly directly into that armada at low altitude and low speed. Because their Mark 13 torpedo could only be dropped below 130 feet at under 130 miles per hour, anything faster, anything higher, and the torpedo would shatter on water impact. Even perfect drops malfunctioned. 36% ran cold, 20% sank, 20% veered wildly off course, and 18% ran at the wrong depth. Only 31% behaved correctly, and even then the warhead's firing pin often failed to detonate. Every pilot in the Pacific knew this. The Bureau of Ordnance knew this. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, sole designer and sole producer of the Navy's torpedoes, had documented every failure since 1923, but Congress protected its monopoly. And the factory, running on peacetime schedules, ignored the Navy's wartime demand for reliable weapons. The pilots paid the price. When Ernest's squadron took off, disaster followed them into the sky. Within the hour, 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down in flames. Not one of their torpedoes exploded. 15 men were killed: Langdon Fieberling, Charles Braun, Oswald Gay, Victor Lewis, Darrell Woodside, and every member of their crews. Only Ernest returned, limping home with 64 bullet holes and 9 20mm cannon hits in the fuselage. Manning was dead in the belly gun. Fryer was bleeding from multiple wounds. Ernest's torpedo had fallen out during the attack, torn free by enemy fire. He never knew whether it would have worked, but based on the Navy's statistics, it probably wouldn't have. The tragedy wasn't caused by pilot inexperience, bad tactics, or faulty aircraft. The real problem was the torpedo itself and what happened the moment it struck the water. The Mark 13 was a 2,216-pound, -1-foot steel cylinder designed in 1925. When airplanes flew at 80 miles per hour by 1942, torpedo bombers approached targets at nearly 300 miles per hour. But the torpedo's internal mechanisms, its fragile gyroscopes, its primitive depth-keeping valves, its delicate propeller shafts had never been redesigned. A water impact at combat speeds produced deceleration forces that shattered guidance systems, bent shafts, jammed depth regulators, and ripped apart warheads. Yet Bureau of Ordnance testing at Newport insisted everything worked so long as pilots dropped torpedoes under impossible, suicidal conditions, 130 miles per hour, 100 feet altitude, flying straight and level for 10 seconds directly at an enemy ship, inside the deadliest envelope of anti-aircraft fire. It was a death sentence masquerading as doctrine. The failures mounted. During training in 1941, 10 test drops produced 9 failures. At the Coral Sea, recovered torpedoes showed perfect runs, but the Mark 6 detonators had malfunctioned. At Santa Cruz, 12 perfect drops against the carrier Zuikaku produced 2 hits, neither of which detonated. Dying pilots radioed home in frustration. Torpedoes hit, but no explosion. Tell them the torpedoes don't work. Letters home were censored, diaries quietly confiscated, and squadron commanders told to maintain confidence in a weapon everyone knew was broken. But the truth could not be buried. By late 1942, American torpedo bomber losses were catastrophic. Their attacks often suicidal gestures that accomplished nothing. The pilots knew they were being sent into combat with defective weapons. and some began searching for solutions outside Navy channels. Help came not from the Bureau of Ordnance, but from the civilian scientists of the National Defense Research Committee. In January 1943, physicist Charles Lauritsen at Caltech began studying the torpedo problem and makeshift testing range at Mars Dam in California. Using a 300-foot slide to simulate aerial drops, Lauritsen's team filmed torpedoes hitting the water. The footage revealed chaos, torpedoes tumbling nose up, nose down, flat, tail first each angle producing catastrophic, predictable failures. Everything the Navy believed about torpedo drops was wrong. Low altitude, low speed drops produced belly flops that crushed internal components. High-angle drops produced dives so steep that torpedoes plunged 50 feet before leveling out. Lauritsen calculated that only a narrow 15-degree window of water entry angles would allow a torpedo to function, but pilots had less than a 1 in 5 chance of hitting that window, especially under fire. The solution required stabilizing the torpedo during its fall. The Japanese had solved this problem years earlier using simple, wooden tail fins on their Type 91 torpedoes. Innovations the U.S. Navy had dismissed as primitive. Lauritsen didn't dismiss anything. He began experimenting with fins, parachutes, and attachments. After dozens of failed attempts, his team developed two revolutionary devices: an aluminum shroud ring that reinforced the torpedo's tail section and stabilized it in air and water, and a plywood aerodynamic drag ring around the nose of the pickle barrel that slowed the torpedo enough to prevent destructive impact forces. Together, these attachments transformed the Mark 13. In tests, torpedoes dropped at 1,000 feet and 300 knots entered the water cleanly and ran perfectly. But the Bureau of Ordnance refused to authorize the modifications, so pilots and mechanics went around them quietly. Squadron mechanics traveled to California, trained in secret warehouses, and returned with detailed drawings of the modifications. They installed shroud rings and pickle barrels at night, using unofficial blueprints stamped not approved by Bureau of Ordnance. By June 1944, modified torpedoes were ready for their first combat test. The results were immediate and explosive. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Avengers dropping from higher altitudes and faster speeds than ever attempted scored multiple hits on the carrier Hiyu, and every torpedo detonated. The ship sank. Mechanics across the fleet began modifying torpedoes in secret. Within 24 hours, entire carrier magazines were being refitted. When Bureau of Ordnance inspectors demanded the modifications be removed and the mechanics court-martialed, Admiral Mark Mitcher overruled them. Combat results mattered more than regulations. By October 1944, every torpedo squadron in the Pacific was using the new motto a Mark 13, what pilots proudly called ringtails. At Leyte Gulf, they proved devastating. The super battleship Musashi, designed to survive 20 torpedo hits, sank beneath 19 modified Mark 13s. The next day, Yamato and her escorts suffered the same fate under high altitude. High-speed torpedo attacks that would have been unthinkable in 1942, Japanese officers were stunned. Torpedoes that once missed or failed suddenly hit with terrifying accuracy. What had been a weak, unreliable weapon became one of the deadliest in the Pacific. The transformation reshaped the war. In 1942, American torpedo hit rates were under 5%, with fewer than half of those hits exploding. By late 1944, hit rates exceeded 40%, with 95% detonating successfully. American Avengers became the most feared ship killers in the world. Japanese sailors called them demons of the sea, and it had all begun with failure that pilots had endured, scientists had confronted, and bureaucracy had tried to bury. The story of the Mark 13 torpedo is the story of how lives were lost, lessons were learned, and innovation from the outside finally gave American aviators the weapon they deserved.